pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're so grateful that you can join us. Just a minute, we're going to be talking about the spoken gospel, and then at the bottom of the hour, we're going to be talking with our good friend Jerry Newcombe about America's pilgrim heritage. I think you will appreciate that conversation as we get ready for Thanksgiving week next week, and certainly there are a lot of things that we will be covering. Certainly, just to bring you up to speed on some of the things in the news, I have posted at least one article about the vote that took place yesterday, which we talked about, to release the Epstein files. Matt Vespa said, well, the writing was on the wall. Congress really was going to vote for that, and it was very simple. A 427-1 vote and unanimous passing in the Senate went to President Trump's desk for signature, although I'm not that convinced that some of this couldn't have happened anyway. But here are a couple of the disclaimers that maybe you have not heard in the news. One is that Donald Trump said on Monday, 2 days ago, that he was planning on signing the bill, but the files may not be released anytime soon. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, it turns out that there are a couple of disclaimers which are in the bill themselves. One of which is the fact that there is the authority granted to the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to withhold or else to redact any material that could endanger national security or jeopardize an active federal investigation. And I believe there are still some federal investigations going on. So while that seems pretty routine, people with the Trump derangement syndrome have already concocted all sorts of conspiracies about FBI agents reducing, reacting, destroying documents and the rest. And of course, if that is the case, as we found out before, sooner or later, the truth will come out. But also there is a very significant issue that we have talked about, and that is that this needs to be a careful process. People don't need to be defamed, don't need to be mentioned, don't need to be called out because they have done nothing illegal, nothing immoral, and yet there were a fairly significant number of people who spent time with Jeffrey Epstein. And the article I give you at least mentions just one name, just illustrative of many others. One of the individuals that was part of, Epstein's billionaire boys club was the owner of the New York Jets, Woody Johnson. He's in the files. We know that he is, but he's not a pedophile. And just having his name there, I think, is something where he might have to defend himself. But given his financial resources, pretty clear that he would be able to do so. What about other individuals who don't have the ability through PR agents and all the rest to do that? And we have seen before individuals who have been maligned in the court of public opinion rather than an actual court, and then at the end they are found to be not guilty, and they come up to everybody and say, where do I go to get my reputation back? So there are some issues there as well. I would be remiss if I didn't mention also that you had some of the individuals who have been associated with Jeffrey Epstein who are on the Democratic side of the ledger. The one of Hakeem Jeffries is one. The other one of Stacey Plaskett, who is the delegate from Virgin Islands, who was even texting with Jeffrey Epstein during a hearing back in 2019. And so this is not necessarily something that is going to only affect Republicans or just some leaders in Congress. Could affect a variety of other individuals. But anyway, that's just kind of a brief summary of this Epstein bill that has passed Congress, and we will learn more as time goes on. We are going to, in just a few minutes, I hope, connect up with David Bowden, He is with the group called Spoken Gospel, something he began a number of years ago after he had actually produced what was called the Poetic.Inc. And so we'll get into some of that. But while we're talking about that, it brings us back to the real importance of Bible reading and hearing the Bible spoken. That's the idea of the spoken gospel. When you think about that, most of the early Christians heard the Bible. They didn't read the Bible. They were hearing the testimonies of disciples. Later on, you had first Mark, and then, of course, later Matthew and Luke and John writing what we today call Gospels. But again, in many cases, those were actually read in church services, not in full ecclesiastical churches, oftentimes home churches. And so in some respects, this idea of the spoken word still very important, and certainly one that we'll talk about in a minute with David. But I thought I would point you to one of the articles I have coming out next week, and that is kind of good news, bad news. Good news is it does appear that the youngest generations, and that would be millennials, Gen Z, and we're going to move probably past using those categories because just generally we see as much diversity as similarity, but nevertheless, younger adults are reading the Bible in significant numbers. And even more interesting, sometimes younger men are attending church and reading the Bible even more than younger women, and that has never happened. So that's really the good news. The bad news is they don't always agree and believe that what they're reading is accurate. So we mentioned it just a week ago, but I did a commentary, which will be out next week during Thanksgiving week, because if you look at the statistics that come from the State of the Church Initiative, and these recently were reported in Christian Post by Leonardo Blair, and I give you a link on that in my upcoming commentary. They did interviews with 12,000 individuals online, which makes it a very reputable study. I might just mention, having done some surveys by myself and with other organizations, that level of investing and interviewing very significant. And what they found is that about 50% of self-identified Christians report reading the Bible at least once a week. That's all good news. They also found, interestingly enough, that younger men are reading the Bible a little bit more than younger women. But then you get into some of the more troubling things, because if you look at Americans in general, really 25 years ago, about 43% thought the Bible was completely accurate. Now it's down to 36%. Even if you look at just self-identified Christians, what they think about the Bible, less than half, 44%, strongly affirm the accuracy of the Bible. So this is one of the reasons why here at Point of View, not only we talk about encouraging you to read the Bible, and in this case, when we're talking about listening to the Bible, we also really want to encourage you to be listening to Point of View, because we do a fair amount of what we call apologetics. Apologetics comes from the word of defense, and it's really the idea that we want to give you lots of confirmation for the fact that the Bible is God's word, and it is accurate, and it's inerrant. And so there are a large number of individuals reading the Bible. That's good news. Not all of them believe that it's accurate. And so, again, that's why we do what we do here at Point of View. Let's take a break. We'll see if we can connect up with Spoken Gospel. But if not, later on, we're going to be talking with our good friend Jerry Newcombe about America's pilgrim heritage. I think you will appreciate that conversation. Next hour, we'll get into, of course, all sorts of other issues in the news. That coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
For the last 3 months, National Guard troops have been deployed in several cities around the country. Unfortunately, one of the major reasons for the urban crackdown is rarely mentioned in the media. Edward Ring writes about the broader reasons for deploying troops. When we discussed this recently on my roundtable on radio, neither of my politically aware guests were aware of the extent of the dangers in our cities. He explains America is being systematically corrupted by foreign crime organizations. These gangs not only have access to staggering profits from drugs and human trafficking, but they also form partnerships and gain access to the resources of hostile nations. The Department of Homeland Security estimates that about $20 to $30 billion in cash from drug sales travel annually from the U.S. into Mexico, but that's not all, since nobody crosses without paying the cartels. It isn't just the American cities that are vulnerable. Foreign gangs have established themselves everywhere in this country. These lethal gangs have $100 billion budgets. Law enforcement in these rural areas cannot cope with these criminal organizations. Another concern is the presence of state actors that are hostile to the U.S. Groups from China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela are working to support forces of chaos. This would include insurgent organizations like Antifa. Instead of the legacy media covering these threats, most of the major news organizations merely portray the attempts to stop these groups as but another example of President Trump's authoritarianism. But the urban crackdown isn't an attack on democracy, but an attempt to prevent a true attack on American democracy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see what we can talk about the economy. One of the things I've noticed is that they always like to compare the prices of putting on a Thanksgiving dinner from last year to this year. If you look at some of the surveys, and I'll give credit to Wells Fargo, they say that the costs are lower this year than they were last year. But if you go to ABC News, they're citing some survey that says that they are higher. And I think it brings us to a conversation which will have more of a discussion in the second hour today on this issue of affordability. As I've said on numerous occasions, I am convinced that that particular word was actually something that was surfaced in a focus group. And as I've also tried to point out more than once, at a time when we were dealing with things that were not affordable, with a 9% inflation rate, which, by the way, you've listened to this program long enough to know that if you really did an apples-to-apples comparison, that was probably closer to 16%, but they've taken different things out of the basket that are used to compute the consumer price index. But nevertheless, Noel Rothman talks about the fact that Americans were already angry about the persistently high and rising cost of basic goods and services when they sent Donald Trump to the White House. They're still angry over the price of consumer products today, and for good reason. Consumer costs have continued to grow during the second term under Donald Trump. And the voter response to this is to actually blame Donald Trump for, in some cases, things that happened before he took office. But in poll after poll, you also have the fact that most Americans, although they maybe aren't listening to this program, blame the Republicans for the shutdown, even though I think, as he points out in his piece here, that government shut down the government in pursuit of tactical objectives. But nevertheless, if you look at another survey, Republicans are also even getting blamed for the public health insurance premiums, which again, as we pointed out, are due, I think any fair objective look at this, are due to the rising insurance premiums because of the Affordable Care Act. We spent a fair amount of time talking about that on Friday, but we will do that once again because I know people kind of tune in and tune out. And so as a result, they also, interestingly enough, have been blaming Republicans for even rising electricity prices. Next hour, I'm going to point out, as we look at the piece by Stephen Moore, that a lot of the prices for electricity have to do with what is happening in, say, blue states compared to red states. But a lot of that brings us back to a conversation that we needed to have had on Monday, and I didn't get into it in too much, so I thought I'd mention, if you go back to my commentary on Monday, I called it shutdown economics, because it turns out that not only are some of the issues that Scott Bessent, Secretary of Treasury, and President Donald Trump are inheriting from the Biden administration, after all, he hasn't even been in office for an entire year, but some of the more significant issues that are affecting our economy right now happen because of the government shutdown. Now, again, if you want to be one of those ones that blame the Republicans because they didn't want to spend $1.5 trillion more on Obamacare subsidies, well, feel free to do so. But I think most of us understand where that came from. And I was pointing out in the commentary that if you go back to Halloween, remember that Friday night? Well, on October 31st, the Federal Reserve has what's called a repo facility. I won't get into the deep weeds here, but this is kind of like emergency funding. Oftentimes we refer to the Treasury General account as the checking account. And some people have tried to say the repo facility is like your savings account. More, it's like a rich uncle that bails you out if you need some money or need a loan. But nevertheless, the repo facility was hit for, this is amazing, $29 billion in one day for emergency loans. That is the biggest spike since the 2020 financial crisis. And by the time the first couple of days of November played out, $125 billion. Now, why was that the case? Well, it goes back to the shutdown. The shutdown was at least part of the reason. When you have 700,000 government employees who are not getting paid, some either just sitting home waiting to get paid in the future, others were actually working but not getting paid, this had a secondary effect on the economy. First of all, they're not paying taxes into the TGA, which is the Treasury General account, although there's a fair amount of money sitting there as well. So those monies in that are to pay bills, pay government salaries, and the rest. But, of course, that was accumulating because we weren't paying them the salaries. And so as a result, money was skyrocketing. Meanwhile, since you didn't have money flowing through the system, the technical term for that is liquidity. You didn't have liquidity, then that income wasn't making its way out there, and the banks were having difficulties there as well. Because if government workers aren't getting paid, think about this. That means mortgages weren't getting paid. That means credit cards weren't getting paid. That means car loans weren't getting paid. And pretty soon, these banks were starving for liquidity. They actually then had to go and hit the repo facility for $29 billion just on that Friday of Halloween. By the way, that's scary enough, isn't it? Just to think of what that might have meant. And again, sooner or later, and I think we're heading to that very soon, we are going to just about 2 weeks from now, less than 2 weeks from now, get to a point where the Federal Reserve will no longer be doing what's called quantitative tightening, where they're actually pulling liquidity out of the market, and they're going to be going into quantitative easing. Nice technical words for they're going to have to print money. And so the banks, have cash, and soon some of the government workers now are putting money back into the system. But then just think about that. All that crash comes crashing all the way into the system again. And so you can see that there are lots of reasons for why the economy looks like it does. And more people are describing it as a K-shape economy. Think of the letter K. One part of the letter goes up, one part of the letter goes down. What's the part going up? Well, that would be the stock market. That would be of individuals that have a great deal of financial resources. That would be people that have assets. And I even have a commentary coming out next week in which I call it Answering Bill Maher, because Bill Maher said, can you explain this economy? We have the haves and the have-nots. Well, the haves are doing pretty well. If you look at the Fortune 500, that stock market is going up. Now, let me just tell you a little secret. Really, only 5 of the 500 are really going up any significant amount, but we'll put that to another discussion. What about the other part? The part that's going down, well, that's you and me. So you have the financial markets, and then you have the physical markets. You have Wall Street, and then you have Main Street. And so, again, people oftentimes like to blame one political party or another political party or the Federal Reserve and all the rest, but a lot of it simply has to do with the fact that we've had such inflation, as you've heard me say so many times before. If you are owning assets, and that could be land, it could be stock, it could be bonds, it could be anything that is not reproduced in a significant way. Of course, it could be Bitcoin, it could be art, whatever it is. It takes more dollars to buy those, so the prices of those go up. But if you are trying to keep pace with your wages, the wages have never, since 1971 when we went off the gold standard, ever kept pace. And so that's why you get this sort of K-shape economy. So we had a problem, which we'll talk about next hour, on affordability that already existed, but what has happened more recently has just taken the problem and made it worse. And there are some other issues, but certainly my commentaries are an attempt each day to help you understand a little bit more about why those dollars in your purse or your pocketbook or in your wallet aren't worth as much. There's some very good reasons for that. So if you go to our website today, you will see that my Viewpoints commentaries about the urban crackdown. I'll talk more about that in the next hour. But if you click on Read Now, you'll see a button that says Never Miss a Viewpoints commentary. And I've noticed that a lot of people that even support this ministry and listen to it every day never taken the time to sign up for my daily commentary. It comes to you free of charge. Glad to send it to you. And you've heard me just in the last few minutes quote from a few of the commentaries, either that have just run or will run next week. And if you would like to have access to those, you certainly can do a search engine on the website, pointofview.net, or we can just automatically send them to your inbox Monday through Friday. Pennant Extras comes to your inbox on Saturday. Let's take a break. We're going to talk about pilgrims with Jerry Newcombe right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Next week is Thanksgiving, and this is a great opportunity as we are talking about the 250th anniversary of this country to once again teach your children and grandchildren some of these spiritual and political and religious and even economic lessons that come from the Pilgrim heritage. We have a link to providenceforum.org, and one of the links there is to America's Pilgrim Heritage, in which we certainly do encourage you to find out a little bit more and to educate us about the Pilgrims and to talk about some of the resources that are available through Providence Forum. We come to our good friend, Dr. Jerry Newcombe, Executive Director of the Providence Forum. You know him as an individual that has been the senior producer and on-air host for Truths That Transform, graduate of Tulane University, also a graduate with master's degree from Wheaton Graduate School and a doctorate from Knox Theological Seminary. With the D. James Kennedy Ministries over the years. He's produced or co-produced more than 80 different television documentaries. He is the author or co-author of 33 different books. And Jerry Newcombe, it is always great to have you on the program.
Thank you, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, talk about the pilgrims. If we go to Providence Forum, they talk about the fact that we always think about Thanksgiving and football, but really this is the area that gave us the pilgrims, the Puritans, settled New England, gave us the earliest constitutional governments, gave us the Mayflower Compact. In some respects, we owe a great debt of gratitude to those who came 100 years before we even had a United States of America.
That is absolutely true. And the Pilgrims who settled in Plymouth in 1620 were just ordinary people who just wanted to worship Jesus in the purity of the conscience. As the Bible was rediscovered in the 1500s, it started to impact many people in England, and most of them were Puritans. That is, they wanted to stay within the Church of England and work for its purity. That's why they were called that. But a small sliver of Puritans, that is, they believed in the Bible and so forth, felt that, you know what, this is so far gone. We just can't, do this. We got to come out and be ye separate. And they were separatists. Mm-hmm. And this one particular congregation that was born in Scrooby, England, about 100 miles or so north of London in the Midlands, they became an individual, independent congregation. Now, secretly, because you couldn't do this out in the open, even their worship services, they always had to worry about the king's troops, banging on the doors and arresting people and so forth, because it was illegal at that time to do this. Now, they went to the regular church, too, and they paid their tithes. They were forced to do that. But eventually, they were like, okay, look, let's, there's toleration, religious toleration in Holland. Let's see if we can get there. And even that, to migrate to Holland was not easy, but they did eventually get to relocate to Leiden, Holland. And then after about a dozen years or so working there, as they were getting older, as their children were being tempted to follow the ways of the Dutch youth, who were a lot more worldly and so forth, they then learned about the success, the permanency of the Jamestown colony. So they ended up applying for, and they got permission to go to the New World. And when they finally made it, with the Mayflower and everything, they were blown off course, and they had hired some strangers who were sympathetic with their goal to create a church commonwealth. They had a Bible-based commonwealth in the New World, but they were not in the right place, and they were not under the patent because they were blown off course. They were going for the northern parts of Virginia. In those days, Virginia was much bigger and so forth. But they were 250 miles away in Cape Cod, so before they set foot on the American soil, they wrote up a political covenant, which is based on the biblical covenant, which is really the way they were born as a congregation about a dozen or so years before, or 14 years before. And it's called the Mayflower Compact. And it became the first step to a free Christian people writing up their own governing thing, their own governing document. And it's the example of self-rule under God. It begins in the name of God, amen. And they talk about how they came over in this voyage for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, and we do covenant and combine ourselves into a civil body politic. And then, as was the custom of the day, the men all signed this Mayflower Compact, November 11th, 1620, and as I say, this was the first step towards what would culminate 150 years later with a lot of other covenants, along the way, including William Penn's frame of government and so forth. But finally, it culminates with the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And it all began with those pilgrims on board the Mayflower ship in writing up this Mayflower Compact. They made history, and all they wanted to do was just be left alone to worship Jesus in the purity of conscience.
Let me, if I can, just have a quote that I've seen in one of your books from Paul Johnson, who wrote A History of the American People, because he said what was remarkable about this particular contract was that it was not between a servant and a master or people and a king, but between a group of like-minded individuals and each other with God as a witness and symbolic co-signatory. That, in some respects, is what even some of our secular historians have said was kind of the first constitution in America, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That's what began the whole process, and I just think that's fantastic. By the way, since you mentioned Paul Johnson in his book, A History of the American People, listen to some of the things he said. America had been founded primarily for religious purposes, and the Great Awakening, now he's jumping into the 1700s, had been the original dynamic of the continental movement for independence. The Americans were overwhelmingly church-going, much more so than the English, whose rule they rejected. There is no question that the Declaration of Independence was, to those who signed it, a religious as well as a secular act. And finally, he adds this, and it is important to remember that America as a whole was a religious breakaway from Anglicanism. Anglican arrogance in the early 17th century, that is the 1600s, came home to roost in the 1770s. Religion was the biggest single motive in getting people to hazard all on the adventure. He wrote that in reference to the Pilgrims and the Puritans.
Wow.
So this is a really, I think this is a critical point.
I do want to talk about some of the spiritual lessons and economic lessons and all that, but let's just for a minute, since we are pointing to the Thanksgiving celebration, if again you go to providenceforum.org, we've already got a link there, talks about the fact that after a time of great suffering, after the first harvest, they invited their Indian friends, and this was an opportunity to have the first Thanksgiving, which began to be a tradition in New England, and eventually, of course, today, is a national celebration. But again, we go back to a very significant event that came because, once again, they were grateful for God's provision in the midst of incredible suffering. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Half their number died the first winter. So they arrived in November 9, 1620. They discovered Plymouth in December of 1620. And even that, there's a providential angle to it. The land was cleared, and the people before them had died of a plague, and it was a safe place for the Pilgrims to be. And then they eventually, when they found the Indians and made friends with them in the Treaty of Peace, they paid for all the land that they got and so forth. But with that winter, it was so brutal, and they weren't used to this, and they had to kind of, for the most part, live on the Mayflower, and half of the people were dying. It was almost like each day that went by, 1, 2, or 3 people would die on average, and it was very difficult. Then when the spring finally flawed, then they met providentially, a couple of Indians, including one who could speak English, Squanto, who became a special interpreter for them. He's the one who helped interpret and translate so that they could make that Treaty of Peace, and they were able to, plant some crops and have a meager harvest, and then they celebrated with their new friends, the Indians, in the basically harvest time of 1621, and they enjoyed 3 days of Thanksgiving to God and Thanksgiving with their new friends and so forth. It was beautiful, and that became the prototype of our Thanksgiving.
Yes.
It's interesting, though. I will say this. The people from Virginia like to say, wait a minute, before the Pilgrims even came here,
Jamestown.
The first Thanksgiving was in Jamestown, 1619. Don't forget the Virginia part.
Let's take a break. When we come back, I do want to talk about maybe some of the religious or spiritual lessons, some of the political lessons, some of the economic lessons, because there are quite a number. These are the kinds of things that you can share around the table. And, of course, we've got a link to Providence Forum and, of course, also a link to Jerry Newcombe so you can find out more about his books and a way in which you can take advantage of those resources. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to go to the website, pointofview.net, we have a link to, of course, providenceforum.org. Generally, we also have a link to the America's Pilgrims Heritage and some of those. And Dr. Jerry Newcombe, for just a minute, let's talk about the forum because there are so many resources. I had a couple of links, one which is just general to the Providence Forum, which goes through all the different blogs. So if people want to educate themselves, there is a long, long list of those. Then they have another link to America's Pilgrim Heritage so that you can at least find that in the midst of all the other material. But you have videos, documentaries, podcasts, and the rest. What's available for people if they land on your website?
Sure. The one part that I often try to make is among the very first things that you'll see if you go to providenceforum.org is the Christian Foundation series, the Foundation of American Liberty. It's basically, it's a 7-part series of 1-hour documentaries, and I've divided them up into tiny little, 5-minute segments, virtually all of them. But it begins with the Pilgrims and culminates with the Constitution. So it's a Pilgrim City on a Hill, the beginning of wisdom, which is all about how, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's all about education in America. And in fact, this is where America got off on the right way, and this is where America got off on the wrong way. In other words, education, because it used to be that the Bible was the chief textbook in one way or another. So by the time you get to the Founding Fathers, these people were people who were informed with a biblical worldview. And even learning their ABCs, they learned it that way. So anyway, continuing with some of the programs in that series, The Road to Independence, and then there's George Washington, endowed by the Creator, all about the Declaration of Independence, and then finally, We the People. And We the People, by the way, wraps things up with, answering questions like, well, what about slavery and mistreatment of the Indians and so forth. Now, I've got in front of me the documentary, The Pilgrims, the one that started it all off that I made a few years ago. And the guests include Bill Federer. I know you've had him on many times.
Yes.
By the way, he was with Charlie Kirk 2 or 3 days before Charlie was killed. You may want to ask him about that sometime. They would have him often coming there. Then also there's Bill. So there's Bill Federer. There's William Wrestling Brewster, who is a direct descendant of the first de facto minister of Plymouth, Brewster. And then there's Paul Jaley, the president of the Plymouth Rock Foundation.
Right.
There's Rod Gregg, who wrote a book called The Pilgrim Chronicles.
And we've had him
tremendous.
On. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, he's absolutely tremendous. And then there's also Leo Martin, who did a wonderful job. He's basically, he founded something called the Jenny Center there in Plymouth, and along with his wife, Nancy. He's terrific. And there's Dennis Prager, and also Alveda King. Alveda King, the niece of Martin Luther King Jr., kind of wraps up the whole thing in a bow. It's so beautiful, where she just kind of explains the whole Pilgrim experience in about 1 minute, and it's so eloquent. It's like, wow. She just hit it out of the park.
Let me just mention real quickly, we do have Bill Federer on next week. So, again, I'll be looking forward to that. But just before I wind down, and for those of you that have been watching online, I've dressed for the part. I look like a pilgrim today, for those that maybe have noticed. But we've talked about, in some respects, the religious issue, because they left first England and then Leiden, the Netherlands, and we really believed in religious liberty. We've talked also about the political with the Mayflower Compact, but there's also an economic lesson, and that is after the first year, the colony had a collective economic system, which, by the way, looked a little bit like Marxism, and that was not working. And so as a result, William Bradford implemented what today we would call a free market system. Is that true?
Absolutely. This common store was imposed upon them by the people back in London who had, basically funded their voyage. It was very expensive to be able to do this, to have this transportation to get to the New World and everything. So they basically, I don't know why, but they thought, well, if everything is owned in common, then somehow it will produce a greater profit, which it did not. In fact, it caused the productivity to really go down, because if you worked real hard, you'd get just as much as the person next to you who didn't work at all. And these were very godly people, and socialism didn't work. Socialism is contrary to human nature.
Yes.
And we've discovered that over and over and over.
Let's, if we can, talk about how people can use some of the resources. You have podcasts, you have videos and all of that. And next week is Thanksgiving week, and we'll have, as I said, Bill Feder on, and he can kind of pull together a few other points that we haven't made here. But I would love to have you just talk about what you might encourage people to do to take advantage of all the great resources there at Providence Forum.
Sure. Well, so much of it is online. So we have so many articles, like what I just mentioned to you about the Pilgrims and their, experiment with socialism. If you go to providenceforum.org and just put in, socialism, there's an article I wrote all about it. It explains all the details and gives the quotes and everything. And by the way, they ended up having to do that for a couple of years.
Yes.
And so finally, Bradford, who was their governor, said, we are going to stop this after 2 years, because they were literally, facing hunger because the results were so meager and so forth. So then he said, wow, we thought we were smarter than God, in believing this vanity of Plato. Plato was one of the first, going back to ancient Greece, one of the first to advocate for socialism. It's a bad idea. It's been experimented and tried over and over and over. And I like to say there's not one square inch on the planet where socialism works. So anyway, articles, books, videos, and podcasts, and even quizzes. All of these can be found at providenceforum.org. The foundation series is even being developed into a curriculum. And so this is something that's very exciting, curriculum for homeschooling.
Mm-hmm.
And so this interview. Yeah.
Well, again, we're just about out of time, but I just wanted people to know that their place to go is Providence Forum. And again, matter of fact, when that curriculum's out, let's get you on and talk about how we can use that in the homeschool, Christian school movement and everything. But I just wanted to spend just a few minutes educating people about what is at Providence Forum. Of course, you can also find Jerry's books, and I have many of them on my shelf, and you've heard me quote from many of them before. So, Jerry, nothing else, I want to wish you a happy Thanksgiving, and thank you for educating us today about the Pilgrims and our heritage.
Sure. Thank you, Kerby. Appreciate it. Happy Thanksgiving. And
we will take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news, and we'll see if we can connect up with some other individuals. But, of course, we have quite a bit. We, of course, have the release of the Epstein files. This whole issue of affordability, which I talked about a few minutes ago, I want to get into it in more detail because Stephen Moore has done a good job of that. Jonathan Turley, I quote him from time to time, even though he would probably disagree with a lot of things we talk about here. Nevertheless, as a liberal Democrat, has said, we've got to reverse the dumbing down of American higher education. And I thought we'd end with another very good piece about we need to make sure we choose the right road, and a piece by Bradley Thayer, elites and civilization, and especially elites and Western civilization, very much pair up with some of the things we talked about yesterday in the second hour. So a lot coming up. If you would like to know more about some of the topics we've addressed so far, they're on the website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today as we get back into some of the issues in the news. I did mention it a little bit at the beginning, but it's worth coming back to again. That is the issue of the Epstein files. That has been something that has been kind of front and center over the last week, and it's worth mentioning that it did indeed pass the House of Representatives 427-1. Might just mention for just a minute, the one was an individual that was very concerned about the fact that this could have a negative impact on individuals. It was Representative Clay Higgins who opposed it and actually was concerned that it might damage individuals, that in some respects, because we live in a world where before you even get your day in court, there is the court of public opinion, and if individuals are mentioned even in passing in some of these particular documents, what could be the impact that they could have on them? So I want to raise that issue now, which a lot of people have just set aside, but it is of concern, not because we want to not prosecute the guilty. We just want to protect the innocent. And so that is, I think, an argument that he made, but it was the only nay vote in the Senate. It was passed by unanimous consent. So there we are. It's on the table. The president may have already signed it. I don't know. I haven't really paid attention to that. And again, he said he would sign it, but he also acknowledged that the files may not be released anytime soon. There is a process, and Democrats are going to scream about the fact the process is taking too long. You anticipate that being the case. And, of course, there is a go-ahead to release those files, but not all of them. Again, let me try to give you some of the disclaimers. First of all, even when we find accurate files, there's another reason not to release them. Some of the files contain child pornography. Not going to release those. So that's the first issue there. The bill that was passed by the House and Senate does grant the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, the authority to withhold or to redact any material that could endanger, here's the two qualifications, national security or jeopardize any active federal investigation. And so that is the case as well. And there also needs to be, as many people have pointed out, and that's my first article, for you can read it through in its entirety, to make sure that there is a careful process, that people don't get defamed. Just because they're mentioned in the files doesn't mean that they engaged necessarily in illegal or aberrant sexual behavior or immoral behavior, so that is the case. I'm sure that there are at least a few Democrats that are now saying, I wish we wouldn't have voted for this, because, as I mentioned just a minute ago, you have Stacey Plaskett, who, of course, we already know was receiving text and texting with Jeffrey Epstein during some of the hearings many years ago. You have, of course, a couple of very prominent Democrats are mentioned in one way or another. So we'll see where this all goes. But nevertheless, that's where we are with the Epstein files. More to come, and certainly already a number of conspiracy theories kind of surfacing along the way. If you just joined us, last hour we did spend a little bit of time talking about the Pilgrim heritage. Understand that our guest who is supposed to be with us in the first hour, David Bowden, will be with us the last segment, so we'll get into some of the issues of the spoken gospel. But let me get into, again, the fact that much of this is happening because we're already in the midst of midterms. You might say, well, they don't vote till next November. We've got 12 months. Yes and no. Yes, we don't vote for the midterm elections till next November, but already people are deciding whether they're going to run or not run based upon how much funds they can raise. And something I'll just mention in passing as to whether or not some of the gerrymandered districts will be constitutional. State of Texas the other day suffered a defeat at the hands of a federal judge who said that not only are these gerrymandered districts in Texas providing political opportunities for Republicans, but some of them actually violate the Voter Rights Act of 1965. So we'll see where that goes. The Supreme Court is supposed to rule on an appeal, but if I remember right, isn't it like December 8th or something like that, in which people are going to file? And if you don't know which district you're going to file for, because some of those might have moved, it might become a moot point. So there are just a lot of things going on in the background. Don't want to cover all of that today, but it illustrates once again that right now, because most of the people in the press are more likely to support Democrats than Republicans. As I mentioned just a minute ago, there are some surveys that have come out, and some of the most recent ones, 2 different polls, indicate that right now, most Americans, not all, but most Americans, at least a majority of Americans, tend to blame the Republicans for the government shutdown. I think any fair-minded assessment of that, if you really look at the facts, would say this was due to Democrats in the Senate not willing to pass a continuing resolution. But it shows that when the press doesn't accurately cover that story, then you have many people that are going to be running for re-election, or even new candidates running, who are going to be at a disadvantage because the general mood is the assumption that Republicans are to blame for the shutdown. And then this most recent poll by Navigator, the Navigator survey, showed that voters believe that the Republican Party is also responsible for the increase in health insurance premiums, even though, again, part of the reason for the shutdown was because of the demand, not just the request, but the demand that we increase these enhanced subsidies, which were implemented as emergencies during the pandemic, but continue to the end of this year. And of course, that also illustrates the fact that even though these particular insurance premiums, these enhanced subsidies to premiums, were indeed for the Affordable Care Act, which were passed exclusively by Democrats under Barack Obama, nevertheless, somehow Republicans get blamed for that as well. After we come back from the break, I'll mention one more. That poll also found that they blame Republicans for rising electricity costs. I'll explain how Stephen Moore responds to that, but even just apart from comparing red states to blue states, there's a reason why the cost of electricity is going up, and that's the rise of artificial intelligence and all of these power-hungry data centers which are being built around the country. So when we come back, I want to get into this issue of affordability. That's the buzzword of the day. It's the mantra that Democrats have used to win some elections in New York City and in New Jersey and in Virginia. And so I want to get into that in some detail, talk about probably some of the reasons to begin to reevaluate those, but also to understand as we move into what are going to be these midterm elections, first the primaries and then, of course, the general election. What does that mean for the future? So we're going to get into that in some detail, once again getting into some of these economic issues that will have an impact on the political landscape as well. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
For the last 3 months, National Guard troops have been deployed in several cities around the country. Unfortunately, one of the major reasons for the urban crackdown is rarely mentioned in the media. Edward Ring writes about the broader reasons for deploying troops. When we discussed this recently on my roundtable on radio, neither of my politically aware guests were aware of the extent of the dangers in our cities. He explains America is being systematically corrupted by foreign crime organizations. These gangs not only have access to staggering profits from drugs and human trafficking, but they also form partnerships and gain access to the resources of hostile nations. The Department of Homeland Security estimates that about $20 to $30 billion in cash from drug sales travel annually from the U.S. into Mexico, but that's not all, since nobody crosses without paying the cartels. It isn't just the American cities that are vulnerable. Foreign gangs have established themselves everywhere in this country. These lethal gangs have $100 billion budgets. Law enforcement in these rural areas cannot cope with these criminal organizations. Another concern is the presence of state actors that are hostile to the U.S. Groups from China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela are working to support forces of chaos. This would include insurgent organizations like Antifa. Instead of the legacy media covering these threats, most of the major news organizations merely portray the attempts to stop these groups as but another example of President Trump's authoritarianism. But the urban crackdown isn't an attack on democracy, but an attempt to prevent a true attack on American democracy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's talk about this word affordability. That, as I've mentioned before, was a buzzword that no doubt surfaced in some focus group, and all of a sudden you began to hear Elizabeth Warren talking about that, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about it, and Bernie Sanders talking about it, and especially Zohran Mamdani. And so I think what you're talking about here is a word that has connected with the American people, and it is going to be heard a lot more between now and next November, because if it worked for some of these elections, you can be sure that Democrats will use them again. And so when we talk about that, there are a couple of ways to respond to it. And I think President Trump's response has not been very helpful because, as Nate Jackson points out, when you say that kind of the word of the year has been the word affordability, President Trump said, I don't want to hear about affordability, just dismissed it as kind of a dead issue. He referred to it as a con job. And do you remember the Biden administration had the highest inflation in 48 years? Yeah, certainly true, all true. But it is, I think, important to recognize that it's wrong to dismiss this idea of affordability because prices have gone up in 2025. Yes, the president is correct in pointing out that inflation is far lower than it was, but I think you're going to have to find some ways to communicate in a more effective way, especially as we just pointed out a minute ago. One of the things that, and again, Nate Jackson talks about this, the Democrats have in their favor is the, if you will, almost the amnesia that the mainstream press has about what it was like this time a year ago, what it was like 18 months ago. And as a result, they can be really be defending Democrats, talking about this issue of affordability, and even trying to say that, well, it's really the Democrats that want to lower the cost of your health insurance, even if they are the ones that want to increase the enhanced premiums. It's Democrats that care about the common worker, even though they want to raise the minimum wage, which actually hurts those entry-level individuals. Democrats want to feed the hungry, even though many of them were the ones that continued the shutdown and even prevented SNAP from being paid. And you can get the idea that there would be an obvious response to each one of those, but unless some of these candidates are themselves able to break through some of the noise to get the signal to the voters, it could be really very difficult for the midterm elections next year. But let's also recognize that even though the president has been willing to dismiss this political buzzword, it resonates with a lot of voters. I have a commentary coming out in a while in which I just pull some of the comments and even statistics from a YouTube rant by Adam Livingston. And he was making the case for all sorts of other issues, but he uses a couple of numbers that just remind us of why this resonates. He said since the year 2000, real prices have gone up over 150%, while wages have been flat. Some Americans remember when you could raise a family on one income. Now you need 2 jobs and 3 side hustles. Why aren't millennials buying homes? Well, maybe because our paychecks look like tips and your fiscal policy turns starter homes into lottery jackpots. And you're being taxed like a Rockefeller but living like a medieval peasant. And then premiums for medical costs are up 740% since 1980, and goes on to say, let's review. You can't afford a home. You can't afford to get sick. Oh, and of course, student debt is up. You can't afford to get smart. And so even in the maybe hyperbole that he engages in, he illustrates the fact that this issue of affordability is going to be around for a while, and we'll be talking about it certainly here on Point of View. Which brings us to our next article by Stephen Moore. Want lower prices, more affordability? Move to a red state. He says the buzzword for the month, I'd say it's buzzword for the year now, is affordability. Based on the election results from New York, New Jersey, and Virginia, voters think it's declining. And he says it's true that people are angry about prices. Steaks and hamburgers, he said, are more expensive than ever. So are coffee and rents and medical care. Many Americans are about to see a 10 to 20% increase in their health care premium starting in January. And I think that's a conservative estimate. And so Stephen Moore says, well, who's to blame? Well, President Donald Trump said he would bring prices down. That hasn't happened. His tariffs have nudged up prices on certain products like coffee and cars. But since Trump came into office, the inflation rate has fallen. So, again, you can point to the inflation rate, but you have to point to some other things as well. He says it's important to remember why inflation soared to a high of 9% under President Biden. He launched a $4 trillion spending spree. He says, remember the Build Back Better law or bill? And all of that was paid for by printing and borrowing money, which caused inflation to spike. But then he goes on to remind us that, yes, uniformly you see some of this, but it's different depending on what state you live in, because it turns out, as he said, states where Democrats rule, inflation tends to spiral out of control. And if you want to get this article, it is our second article on the website. He actually gives you a summary from U.S. News and World Report, which looks at the most expensive states and the least expensive states. And 9 of the 10 most expensive states are either blue or purple states. He points out that New Hampshire is kind of the one outlier, whereas all 10 of the lowest cost states are run by Republicans. If you'd like to know where they are, first of all, we broadcast in those states. The 5 lowest cost states are Arkansas, South Dakota, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. Those are the 5, but if you go and look at the next 5, you also see many of those are red states as well. What are the 5 highest cost states? Well, that would be California, New York, Massachusetts, Illinois, and New Jersey. And again, if you look at some right next to it, many of those still are blue states as well. So then he goes into a little bit of an explanation why. First of all, you have some of these more liberal policies. Blue states have higher taxes, and some of those costs get passed on to consumers. The states with the highest income tax, California, New York, and New Jersey, are all on the top of the list of the most expensive states. Blue states are also likely to have high minimum wage requirements, higher energy costs due to expensive green, renewable energy mandates, stricter forced union policies, and high-cost regulations that restrict new housing, which raise the cost of buying a home in those states. Gas is as much as $1 more per gallon in many of the blue states compared to others due to various regulations and less oil and gas infrastructure. And then you come to the one on electricity. Well, first of all, nationwide, electricity has gone up, partially because of AI and these data centers, but also electrical costs are on average much higher in states like California, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Washington because of some of the climate change policies that have restricted cheap energy and are very different than what you find in places like Texas and Utah. So he says there are just a few examples of how Democratic policies and politicians make products more expensive, not less expensive. It turns out that the panoply of progressive feel-good policies is what make consumers feel angry and financially stressed out. And the result is middle-class consumers pay a high price for progressive and anti-business policies in state capitals. So he concludes by saying, so if you're in search for lower policies and want to make your paycheck go further, one fail-safe strategy is move to a conservative place with free market policies. Suddenly, you will all of a sudden discover that everything is a lot more affordable. We're going to hear a lot more about affordability. I have a commentary coming out. I already gave you just a few examples of why this resonates with the American voters, and it's going to be an issue, and individuals that are running, especially on the Republican ticket, and maybe even some Democrats, are going to have to answer those questions about affordability when they are confronted by the voters. Even those who are Democrats are going to have to answer that question if they are running for re-election, and certainly all the Republicans are. So it's going to be an issue, and even though some have mentioned it as the buzzword of the month, I think it's the word of the year. We'll see over the next 30 days which word of the day or word of the year is picked, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be that one, and that means you're going to hear a lot more about it in these 2026 midterm elections. If you'd like to read a little bit more, this Stephen Moore piece gives you the facts and figures. It's on the website, and we'll be back with more right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will. You can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now. Be informed. Pointofview.net. Click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, and I might just mention in our last segment, we're going to have a chance to talk with David Bowden. We were going to talk with him earlier, but we'll get a chance to find out a little bit more about the spoken gospel in just a few minutes. But let me, if I can, go through two articles, which I was going to maybe do over the last two segments, but we'll put them together. First is by Jonathan Turley, and it is How to Reverse the Dumbing Down of American Higher Education. Jonathan Turley, as we've mentioned before, is a professor at George Washington University, and he is a law professor, but he has written about this many times before, and he points out that there is a new report, a faculty report came from the University of California at San Diego, that found that 1 in 8 of its students required remedial math classes due to what they call the plummeting admission standards at the school, and there has been a similar kind of disclosure at Harvard. So it seems to me that it's time to say maybe some things need to change, you think? And so as a result, he says, for more than a decade, some of us have been writing about the decline of academic standards in higher education, from lowering admission standards to increasing grading curves. And I've talked about that the other day, the number of individuals at Harvard that are expected to get an A, even if they've done hardly any work at all. And so he says that years ago, we used to have this focus on meritocracy. But then more recently, we've had advocates who have wanted to have greater diversity in admissions, which is an admirable goal, but not if you then end up lowering the standards. And that is exactly what has been taking place. And so you've had, for example, people that have denounced the use of any kind of standard testing as racist and maybe even a barrier to minorities. And so you've even had individuals that have actually required a study of whether or not we should have standardized tests or whether they should be returned. And then you have individuals that simply go on and ignore all of that as well. He even wrote about that back in 2021, when at the time, the University of California president, Janet Napolitano, if you might remember her from the Clinton years, announced that the 10 schools in the system would no longer base admissions on standardized tests. But nevertheless, the report showed that test scores were better predictors of first-year GPA than high school point averages, and whether or not you would have first-year retention of students, in other words, whether they would flunk out. And so she thanked them for that and killed the standardized test anyway. So it's pretty obvious, if you want to have students do better, then you should maybe raise the standards. And if you want to make sure that you have individuals in colleges who are able to do the work and able to graduate, hopefully within 4 years, there are some obvious things you need to do, and he goes into some detail in that regard. And it's always encouraging when, whether it's Jonathan Turley or William Galston or a number of other people who served in the Clinton administration who are liberal Democrats, saying the same things we've been saying for years when we've done interviews with everybody from Ben Shapiro to Heather McDonald. So I wanted you to see that piece. I could have gone into it in more detail, but I wanted to end with this piece by Bradley Thayer, because what he is doing is, in a sense, very similar to how we ended the program yesterday. You might remember, if you happen to be listening, then you can certainly find this again, that Emily Seidel, who is the president and CEO of Americans for Prosperity, talked about two competing visions for America. Which one will you choose? Will you choose the one that the founders have given to us, one in which we recognize that a bottom-up empowerment works better than a socialist or Marxist top-down kind of idea that is now going to be implemented for sure in New York City by Zohran Mamdani? And she says, I know which one I'll be fighting for, and that is the vision that the framers gave us, which allowed for the greatest amount of freedom and the greatest amount of creativity in entrepreneurship. Well, this one by Bradley Thayer is actually one that even now looks beyond America to Western civilization. He says, decades in the making, Western civilization faces a profound crisis in its political leadership. The problem the West confronts is clear for too long. Western leaders in Canada, Europe, and the United States willfully abandon the core principles of Western civilization. These policies include multiculturalism, progressivism, were anchored in a Marxist-Leninist thought. Their impact has been what? Catastrophic, he says. Their consequence is that the future of Western civilization is now in the balance. And he says this was done deliberately. A little bit later, he goes on to point out that the populations of these great nations demand an end to such things as mass immigration, while their leadership refuses to actually accept their demand as legitimate. In reality, the elites will not change their policy, and they will not end mass immigration. Probably more true in Europe right now than in the United States because of who the president is, but nevertheless. He says, here, interestingly enough, the West is in the curious position of permitting its statutes to be toppled and its civilization destroyed by those who have the freedom to hold the West in contempt, a freedom that was made possible by that civilization. And he says it is time to ask Quo Vadis of the West, where is it going? And he says two paths are available, very similar to the piece by Emily Seidel talking about the two paths for America. He's now talking about the two paths for Western civilization. The first is the one we don't want. It's the continuation of the destructive path that Western European and Canadian leaders, as well as most of the American elite, have chosen. But their people reject clearly and consistently. The path will dissolve the West and do so very quickly. It will also deepen tensions with the Trump administration because the Trump administration's on the side of the populations, as President Trump has warned Europe many times. The second path, I think you'd figure that out, is to save Western civilization. Like the story of Peter encountering Christ on the Appian Way, now is the time to gain courage, to reverse course, and to confront the problems our civilization faces. Now is the time for Western leaders to have the confidence in Western civilization that their predecessors possessed. And he says, if nothing else, this issue illustrates, like no other matter, the fork in the civilization road. Once again, we have to recognize that the crisis of legitimacy for the Western elite will be resolved either by crushing their publics, by weaponizing the state against them, or heating their people. It's just as simple as that. You are seeing more and more attempts, I might just add, he doesn't say this, in Europe to try to increase more government surveillance and to really close down opportunities for people to speak out against some of the things the elites are trying to implement on them. And so it's not surprising that you see some of that taking place. He goes on to explain that to accomplish this, the West needs leaders that it does not possess outside of President Donald Trump and Viktor Orban, who, by the way, is the president at Hungary. They possess a strong civilizational confidence based upon an understanding of the greatness of Western civilization. But he says new leaders and new political parties are needed in the UK, Ireland, and in Europe. A new generation of Western leaders of their own parties needs to rebuild what was destroyed in the West. We must unite these leaders with their populations, and what will unite them is civilization confidence. He says the West must be saved, and indeed it can be. President Trump and his administration are helping mightily by calling attention to the issue, as Vice President J.D. Vance has done consistently with the declaration of some of these Antifa-linked groups in Europe as terrorist organizations. And he goes on to say, the West has failed by its political parties and their leaders. It is time for the people of the West to restore confidence in the greatness of Western civilization. These two pieces, one yesterday on the competing visions for America, which one will you choose? This one, the rebirth of West's civilization confidence, remind us each day we have to choose the path. In some respects, we've chosen the wrong path. We might have to reverse course and go down the other path, but these are choices we need to make. They're the kinds of things we talk about so often here on Point of View. And the piece by Emily Seidel yesterday, the piece by Bradley Thayer today, are ones that I would commend to you. They're on the website at pointofview.net. We come back, we're going to be talking with David Bowden about the spoken gospel. That coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few minutes, we're going to be talking about the spoken gospel with David Bowden. Again, an individual that, as we have mentioned before, has been one of the co-founders of the spoken gospel. Before that, even had founded The Poetic Inc., which was a nonprofit dedicated to equipping the church with the gospel of Jesus. And again, I think you will find not only the great material that we've posted on our website at pointofview.net, which links to David's website, but also a link to spoken gospel. So, David, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, absolutely. Really appreciate you having me on.
I might just mention that I saw the other day one of the press releases about the fact that you finished your 7-year project on the issue of Revelation. And then we also saw one that this month talked about an innovative mobile app. So as people go to the website, they can learn more. But give us some of the background, because there are just a number of things happening all at once at Spoken Gospel.
Yeah, tell me about it. Yeah, last night, actually, we were here in Oklahoma City, and we hosted the premiere of our Revelation film. And so for the last 7 years, we've been making teaching videos on every single book and chapter of the Bible, over 800 resources. So we went through every single book of the Bible, made a short film about it that explains that book's main theme and how it all culminates in the work of Jesus. And we filmed 60 videos for all 66 books of our Bible, and premiered Revelation at a theater last night. And it was a great time to celebrate and just see what God has done over the last years. And then we've done teaching videos on every chapter of the Bible, and just showing the main point of that passage, and then ultimately how it also is all fulfilled in Jesus. So that's what we do at Spoken Gospel. We just try to show everybody how every single part of the Bible is all about Him. And one of the best ways to interact with it is, like you said, our new mobile app. We just launched a few weeks ago. It's absolutely free. You don't even need your email address when you log in. You just download it, and everything's there, our whole library. So anywhere you are in the Bible, you can access free content that explains what you're reading and ultimately how it proclaims the gospel in its own unique way.
Again, we have a link to spokengospel.com. Of course, we also have a link to yours. But I might just tie that in for just a minute, because when we go to your website, it talks about poetry, and that is something that was sort of life-changing for you as well in terms of how to communicate that. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, it was this really interesting and maybe kind of weird thing that God dropped on me almost 20 years ago now. I was getting my undergrad in Bible and biblical languages, and just wanted to teach the Bible. And so I was preaching and writing really nerdy Greek white papers that no one was going to read, and ended up learning about spoken word poetry, this kind of narrative, rhythmic, communicative piece of art.
and started doing it. And before long, God just opened door after door and started getting to travel the world and do spoken word poetry, telling people about the story of the Bible and Jesus. And now we use that art form for every book of the Bible, showing its main story and how it's all about Jesus. So it's been a crazy kind of ride to take this obscure art form that so few people know about and now share it through our videos over 200 million times with people all over the world.
I just mentioned, as we go to your website, of course, there's a place where people can find out about your books. And again, When God Isn't There and Rewire Your Heart, as certainly some that have been there, but also just these poetry videos is something pretty unique. And you really begun to touch the heart of a lot of individuals around the world with this kind of art form, haven't you?
Yeah, it's interesting how it kind of does something different than a teaching or a sermon or a lecture or even maybe an abstract piece of art. There's something about the spoken word and its particular art form that kind of cuts to the heart. It's probably something to do with the fact that we were created with words in the beginning. And I think there's something in our DNA that God uses to just unlock stuff in people's heart with that art form. So it's been really cool to see how he's used it.
And again, one of the things I thought, since you did mention the video of Revelation, I think there are going to be some people that are going to say, well, okay, where can I see that? You had, of course, this event there in Oklahoma City, but it seems to me that this would be a resource that a lot of churches and Bible teachers and others would like to use.
Yes, and so we are going to do the public launch of that, I believe, on Tuesday of next week. Okay. And so go ahead and get the app downloaded, Spoken Gospel app. You just search that on the Android store or on your iPhone app store and download the Spoken Gospel app. It's absolutely free, no email required, and you guys will be the very first ones to get the Revelation video, or you can follow us on YouTube if that's more your thing, and we'll launch it there as well. But it'll be absolutely free, and it'll come out with an introduction video walking through the entire book of Revelation in a narrative storytelling form and just trying to show what its original audience intended that book was. And then we'll also have about 12 teaching videos to walk people through every single literary unit of Revelation at about 5 minutes or less, explaining what is going on in all the crazy symbolism and ultimately how that also just points to Jesus and what he was trying to do to comfort his persecuted church in the first century.
So good. Again, Spoken Gospel app, and that's what you're looking for there. But I thought just before we wind down, I might just mention that one of the things I love about your website is you say, see Jesus in any book. So pick a book of the Bible, watch the introduction, explore every chapter through our devotionals, go deeper with a podcast, and you literally have all 66 books there, so people can click on any one of those, Old Testament, New Testament. And so that's really what you're encouraging people to do. Just go to the website, go to the app, click on something, and see if they can find Jesus in that. And really, of course, we would expect to see Jesus in every book of the Bible. But again, that's one of the things you're challenging people to do, because sometimes when you read through the book of Leviticus or Ruth or something like that, you're going, I'm not sure where I'm going to find Jesus in there. So that's really one of your challenges, isn't it?
That is the whole thing we're about. Absolutely. Yeah, we kind of think about Acts chapter 8 when Philip is talking to the Ethiopian eunuch there, and he has scripture. He's reading the great Isaiah scroll, but he doesn't understand it. And so Philip comes up to him and asks him, do you understand what you're reading? And he says, really honestly, how can I unless someone teaches me? And then it says, beginning with that very passage, he teaches him the good news of Jesus. And so what we do is we do exactly what Philip, or we attempt to do what Philip was doing, starting right where you are. So he was in Isaiah 53, but every single chapter of the Bible, we try to start exactly with that passage and take Jesus seriously from Luke 24 when he said the whole Bible's about him, and say, okay, Jesus, how is this about you? How is the single author of Scripture breathed your life and your image into this passage? Because it's only by beholding Jesus that we can become like him, is what 2 Corinthians 3 says. So yes, that's our goal. You nailed it.
Well, again, David Bowden with us. And again, go to spokengospel.com. You can also go to your app store, look for the Spoken Gospel app. That's where you can find out more about these Bible studies, about this new video, Revelation. And David, appreciate you swinging by to say hello. And again, we wanted people to know about all those resources, and they're on our website at pointofview.net.
Awesome. Really appreciate you spreading the word.
Again, let's, if we can, just before we wind down today, mention real quickly that we have posted quite a number of articles, and I hope that that was a quick enough coverage of Spoken Gospel, but if not, simply go to the website. You can find out more. The app, the video, all sorts of just great resources there. I think you will find those to be fascinating, and maybe we'll talk with him again with some of the other things that they are developing, because we are convinced that we need to get people into God's Word. We need to get God's Word into their lives. We need to have people applying God's Word to every area of life, and that's what we're all about. So if you learned a little bit today about America's Pilgrim heritage, maybe about what's going on in the news with the Epstein files, the issue of affordability, dumbing down American education, and most importantly, the fact that we need to take the right path to the future, not only of this country, but of Western civilization. I think we've covered quite a bit in a short amount of time, so if you want to read more, go to the website at pointofview.net. As always, I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program today. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Don't take any of this for just a few minutes, but you might even click on the button to check the Viewpoints commentary, the videos, and all the rest. It's all there at pointofview.net. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.